Strings of Malice, Book 1, Snowflake in an Alley. An Old Mother Nonsense Story. Chapter 11, Anne Spiritcaller. Dhaldin 23rd Ikrit. A windswept scream sounded in the early morning. It woke the former street mouse with a start, but she was persuaded to believe her dreams to have been the culprit. Even if she didn't remember what they had been about, no one else had been roused by it, not even Lunrith, and her brother was a notoriously light sleeper. Irinka donned a coat Lady Nimue had insisted she keep, on account of it being too small now for the woman, and sneaked downstairs. The main floor of the inn was silent, save for the old gentleman who took the night watch. She asked him for directions, and he gave her a coin to take with her. "They're full of nonsense, that lot," he grumbled in a voice that sounded as though his favourite beverage might be rusty nails. "They only help their own, or those with coin. You might have more luck with the sisters, miss." Irinka thanked him for the coin.
"The sisters are away."
She excused herself, and was on her way. The temple was one of the brothers, the elder gods. At least, that's what Irinka decided on. The Umbra temples that dominated an area had always frightened her, but there were no shadows here. Even in the barely risen sun, the place lit up with magic that reflected off grand pictures, made from mirror and coloured glass. Irinka stood at the crossroads to two sides of the structure, not entirely sure where to go. Why was this place so damn quiet? Sure, it was early, but... She looked down at the coin she'd been gifted. Heads right, tails left. She flipped it. She would never know the outcome, as voices chose that very minute to appear from the ether, and they startled the girl into dropping it. The sound of metal hitting exquisite marble tile echoed and ended when a bare foot landed on it. A woman bent down to retrieve it. She had dark hair and old eyes, despite her youthful face, and Irinka didn't know the name of the spice she smelled of, only that it vaguely made her think of Lunrith. The mouse was so caught up trying to place the scent that it took the other clearing her throat for the girl to realize she was being offered the coin back.
"Thank you, Mrs."
The street mouse murmured, taking it. Why did she look so familiar? "Of course." The woman smiled sweetly. Her voice sounded familiar, and yet not, at the same time. "Don't let go of things like this." The woman chided her with a warm smile. "It isn't good to be throwing around gifts." She then promptly turned to the other woman who'd appeared with her. She made a hand gesture, fingers trailed across the brow, and a flick of the wrist. Honestly, it looked rude, but her tone was that of a friend when she said, "Goodbye, Anne." And then she was gone, faded into thin air with no hint of spell or artifact with which to do it. Simply gone. Irinka had to force herself not to fidget in the silence that followed, in the presence of the one who'd been called Anne, who seemed entirely unconcerned that an entire person had simply faded into thin air before her. The woman stood tall, a crown of metal thorns perched over a veil that fell softly down past her shoulders. Her robes were the colour of the fresh blood from a heavy smoker, and who in Resk wore armour so early in the morning anyway? A chuckle drew Irinka out of her musings.
"Be easy, youngling,"
the woman smirked, somewhat condescending despite her words.
"You are welcome in this place even at such an ungodly hour."
She smiled, and it looked not unnatural.
"I am Priestess Anne Spiritcaller, a conduit of the Soul Forger. If you wanted prayer from those of the other brother, the chapel is open, though those lazy good-for-nothings won't be taking confession or coin for some time yet."
Irinka stepped forward on instinct, unduly fearing the woman might leave her.
"No, please, Priestess, I have a friend and I wanted to know how much it would be to fix his wounds."
She tripped over her words, trying to get them out as fast as possible.
In an area there's a temple on the docks that heals the sailors when they come back from rough seas, and I thought, well...
The priestess hummed thoughtfully and stepped aside to gesture for the girl to come with her. Irinka gathered her courage and walked to the left. The priestess fell into step beside her as she passed.
It would depend on the extent of the damage,
the priestess began.
The cause of the injury and how long your friend has neglected treatment.
She listed off on her fingers at an unhurried pace.
Also, if they let it heal before, naturally or by magic may make a difference in the treatment plan too.
The archway at the end of the short corridor revealed a room beyond, which appeared as though the architects had not been able to come to a compromise between the space being a chapel or a library, and eventually decided to throw caution to the wind, mixing both grandiose ideas together. The bookshelves advanced up every wall to the ceiling, stacked with every known written form, paper, stone, fabric, and wood. Anything and everything that could be scribbled on in some fashion was present. Pews clustered around podiums with divining bowls of holy water. Irinka knew that at least. The madam of the cat house, back in her part of town, had been of the opinion she could speak to the missing goddess, and had one just like these, albeit far less grandly polished and bejeweled. The figures of 4 angels stood taller than any person, carved from green, blue, white, and brown veined stone. One colour stood prouder in each, and a statue of the Soul Forger himself sat as guard over the small domain dedicated to him. The statue was nearly the height of 2 whole houses, by Irinka's guess, yet not so nearly as scary as she'd have thought. The fact it was done in white, grey, and gold probably had something to do with her lack of fear. But she decided that it was more the fact that this statue was smiling and had been sculpted with curly hair. She could see as much, because the magic orb that floated in its hands cast soft shadows across its face. It made the lack of eyes far less daunting.
I don't know the answer to any of those,
Irinka admitted, stopping just beyond the threshold for only a beat, but found her feet moving again when the priestess beckoned her to follow her further.
Well, now that simply helps all the more, doesn't it?
Priestess Anne hummed sarcastically as she strode over to mount the nearest ladder.
Perhaps you know if the mysterious injury was intentional or by accident?
What's the difference?
Irinka grumbled under her breath, but the woman obviously had the ears of an owl because she answered.
An accident would be due to one's own foolishness.
She hummed, and Irinka caught sight of a long sword as the woman's skirts rippled when she climbed. It was unsheathed and looked sharp. It was a wonder it didn't slice fabric or flesh.
If you stare up my skirts any longer, we may have a problem, girl,
the priestess warned her, tone stern, but her mouth contradictorily amused.
Intentional?
The mouse answered quickly, as her face flushed deep red.
Now that is something we can work with.
The priestess chuckled, clearly entertained, and she smacked the ladder to make it whirl around the room. It stopped at a few places, and she pulled books out from places only she might know the designation of, which Irinka was expected to catch, as the priestess carelessly tossed them over her shoulder. Only 2 landed uncomfortably in the mouse's face, and one almost landed in a divining bowl.
Shouldn't a priestess be more careful with her temple's treasures?
Irinka griped, heaving the last 3 onto the nearest table as the woman descended the ladder.
Why, you caught them all, did you not?
The priestess shrugged.
What if I didn't?
Irinka huffed.
But you did.
The priestess disregarded her logic.
Now then, lay them out.
Irinka did as she was told, and the woman took her hands after. She folded them into her own, and red tinged Irinka's cheeks when the priestess's magic made her skin tingle. She didn't understand the smirk that had settled over the woman's lips, until it spread into a full grin. The woman barely released the girl's hands when she whispered,
Catch.
Anne's hand shot up into the air, and the tomes, stones, and scrolls followed suit. They barely hovered when their ascent changed, and then they dropped like rain. Irinka screamed a curse and threw her hands over her head as she ran for cover. The first heavy tome landed just in front of her with a solid thump, blocking her route to safety. She did the next best thing she could, by snatching one from the air beside her and held it over her head as she crouched, hoping it would be protection enough. She waited. No more thumps came. She risked a glance, and the others had stopped falling. all hovering but barely centimeters off the surfaces that would have caught them when she didn't. Wide eyes looked incredulously at Priestess Anne, and the woman sent them all back off to their rightful places with a flick of her wrist.
The risk was that for? You could have killed me?
Irinka shouted, forgetting momentarily where she was and who she was speaking to. The priestess had the gall to snort, as she strode over to retrieve the one that had almost crushed the girl. A large blue thing, with ornate embossing obnoxiously covering it.
We share a building with Ithulos,
she said, as though it were answer enough. It wasn't. Strong fingers curled around Irinka's wrist before she could protest further, and she was put in a chair. Both books placed before her while the priestess held her hands. That tingly feeling was back.
How much are 2 spells gonna cost me?
The mouse asked. Gods above and below, even her tongue felt like sparks were dancing on it.
We shall see when you have your answer.
Priestess Anne hummed as she let go of Irinka's hand.
Now, open both of these to a page that feels right.
Irinka raised an eyebrow.
I can't read.
Did I ask you to read?
The priestess returned the look, although there was certainly mirth behind it.
You can take as long as you like, but don't think about it too hard.
With that, she spun on her heels and left the girl alone with the books. Irinka stared after her before sighing deeply at the books. Maybe priests were just odd. Best to get the deathly monster out of the way first. She ripped open the cover and settled in, leaning her chin in her free hand, propped by her elbow on the table. The mouse got about halfway through what may as well have been blank paper for all it gave her, before something caught her eye. A fan-like plant with thin leaves. She tried to flip past it, but she only turned 2 pages before flipping back and pushing it away from her, still open. She picked up the other book. Priestess Anne made her way over with heavy footfalls and took up the tome. Hopefully she would make more sense of it than Irinka had been able to. Other priests and civilians alike had begun flittering into the temple, and the low murmur of activity that came with them was somewhat distracting. The second book was a thin thing, with an orange hide and a single fancy letter in faded ink on the front. Opening it showed the mouse what she was certain to be a name, though she couldn't tell what it was. She had gone through nearly every page before she saw it. It was on a small description of a near-emaciated hound, but she'd recognize it anyway now. It made her uncomfortable, guessing at its original use. She turned the book around slowly and pointed it out to the priestess, who had taken up a chair nearby and crossed her legs sitting down in it.
This,
the girl said softly. Priestess Anne reached over to pluck the pamphlet from the girl's fingers.
You are not betraying your friend, youngling,
the older woman said simply. Irinka couldn't look at her and pulled nervously at the buttons on her coat.
It's bad, isn't it?
Yes,
the woman answered honestly as the tingling faded from the mouse's fingers. Some 2 hours and 13 minutes later, Girl, what are you doing here? Lady Nimue asked in surprise. She had entered the temple just as Irinka was coming out of the left wing, a small paper tucked into her pocket. The priestess walked beside her.
Lady Nimue!
She jumped. Well, so much for her underhanded mission.
She
blurted out, scrubbing furiously at her red eyes so the woman might not notice how hard she'd been crying.
The girl came seeking guidance.
Priestess Anne piped up, as though the question had been directed at her.
Have you come for guidance too, milady?
I have come for a blessing. Lady Nimue scoffed, eyes narrowing at the woman who stood nearly a head taller than she was. Surely you can tell that I do not need your guidance. The priestess raised an eyebrow, and Irinka had the strangest feeling that, despite the cold words, something was being left out when she continued with her questions.
Do you also know blessings do not take hold if their intentions are unfaithful to their meaning?
Irinka watched Lady Nimue's lips pinch into a thin line, and the priestess's lips quirked into a smirk. The risk? I am aware, Lady Nimue answered, once her face had smoothed back into its usual expression of, I'm better than you. I have prepared my words and prayers carefully, priestess. Priestess Anne cocked her head, her curiosity much more amused now than it had any obvious reason to be.
In that case, come this way, and we may begin,
she said, gesturing back to the left. The lady hesitated, but her insistence that she had an appointment in the light side of the temple fell on deaf ears, and the priestess simply gestured again as she turned on her heels.
Better to make prayers to the one who will care to know your reasons.
Lady Nimue bristled at the blatant implications, but her eyes drifted back to the mouse. Go back to your brother, mouse. She eventually sighed and began striding after the priestess. He is frazzled by your disappearance. It was as good as a dismissal, and Irinka sprinted back towards the tavern they had been relegated to after the shoe shop was closed off to be investigated. On her way, she stopped in next door. Priestess Anne may have refused the gifted coin, but the baker had gratefully accepted it in exchange for a pastry. She found her brother back at the inn, plate of breakfast untouched and frigid. Lunrith looked like he might have been crying, but his smile soon returned when she offered him the pastry and apology. From guilt or concern, she admitted to where she had been, if not the reason for her going, that she had seen Lady Nimue there, and that the books had told her the past he could not speak. It was an awkward conversation. What did the books say? You ask. For once it is not your sister interrupting the tale being told. About the collar in the front? Old Mother Nonsense raises an eyebrow at you, and you feel it, in the bottom of your belly, that she is disappointed with you for not reading between the lines. You really don't know? She replies with a question of her own instead. Your hands tighten around your empty cup as you curl a little tighter under your blanket. The movement of your head and the redness in your cheeks indicate your answer.